I'd like to welcome everybody here. Welcome the temple members. I want to welcome our guests. And we have people now signed into our webinar. And the forums that TOV did last year showed the strong links between hunger, food insecurity, and the affordable housing crisis. And several of us got another reminder about this mitzvah day. We went over to Harry Chapin Food Bank. And when he said that, the CEO said that their clients are really largely working families. And because of the housing prices, they really have to rely on the food bank to make their budgets. And the other perspective that we saw from the forums last year is that the community leaders that were in those forums, they really looked at this temple for guidance. Perhaps it could be the professional makeup of a lot of our members, but it's also the commitments to social justice. I'm Phil Michelle. I'm a relatively new member to the temple. And over the last year, two other members, Joyce Steckman and Janet Edelberg, as well as Betty Schwartz. What we did is we organized as a small group to see if we could start an initiative at the temple for affordable housing, affordable workforce housing. And the intent was to find volunteer positions for our temple members. In our discovery process, almost every organization that we spoke with, people like Jennifer Walker over Naples United Church of Christ, or the people at the Immokalee Fair Housing Alliance, that if you really want to help, you got to talk to Joe Trachtenberg. And also Elizabeth Ratty. She's also well known as a housing advocate. So we're delighted to have them both here. We've asked them to share today their understanding of the magnitude of problems associated with affordable workforce housing in our community. The next session in March, the beginning of March, we're going to learn about successful organizations in our community that are providing affordable housing solutions. And our basic intent is to inspire you, tap your intellectual capital and social justice commitments, and enlist you in organizing and creating volunteering opportunities. Rabbi Miller will set the first perspective that ties our faith to this endeavor, and then he will introduce our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you to those who helped organize our first our first forum on housing in our community, particularly affordable housing. As we do with all of our forums put on by our Tikkun Olam volunteers, we do these in a format that begins rooted in Jewish texts, in our shared values and ideas. We have a starting point, and then we explore what's going on in the world around us. So I'm going to be the one who starts us off with text. Before we get into the text, we do want to acknowledge this is a hybrid event. We have those who are here in person, those who are with us via Zoom. We have these devices around the room called owls that can see pretty much 360 degrees all the way around, catch our sound. And as people are speaking in the room, you will be appearing on the Zoom. So it will see you when you're asking questions or when you're talking. With that in mind, we ask that you please make sure your devices are silenced. The owl has very good ears and will hear if your phone starts beeping or playing music and things. Will be a little bit of a distraction for the others who are here. But we're going to start first with a PowerPoint, looking at the question of what is our obligation when it comes to housing. And if you're here, you can follow along the screens behind me. If you're with us on the Zoom, you'll see the PowerPoint being presented to you on the Zoom. I believe Dustin, they can see that on the screen. Wonderful, thank you. So we start off first with a teaching from Rabbi Jill Jacobs. And Rabbi Jacobs is the head of Trua, a social justice organization here in America, a Jewish organization. And she kind of lays out for us our starting point for this. As she explains, a few Jewish sources explicitly speak that the provision of housing is a means of tzedakah. Most famous among these texts is the exhortation in Isaiah to take the poor into your homes, which is the Haftarah that we read on Yom Kippur. This prophetic cry defines the relief of homelessness as a religious duty, preferable to fast, sacrifices, and other ritual observances. So this is a text study. This part of it is most definitely interactive. What are you seeing here from what Rabbi Jacobs is telling us?
I have an answer. Obviously, to be a servant, you have to take that step to take action to help those. It's one thing to fast, that's about you. It's another thing to make a sacrifice, that's about you. But when you're going outside of yourself to provide housing to other people, then you're putting their needs first and you're following what the law says or what the Torah says.
Okay, so
You have to do that.
So there's something about not just thinking of yourself, but thinking of others. And interestingly, what's the day which we read that Haftarah portion? Yom Kippur, right? Which is supposed to be a day just about us, about afflicting ourselves. And so what's the message? That's what Isaiah is telling the people on that day, that more than fast, more than your sacrifices, this is what God wants. What can we take from that teaching from Isaiah?
Well, it's a sense of obligation rather than an elective, something you could do.
Okay, so a sense of obligation, and not just obligation to ourselves, but obligation to others. In a way, it's not unlike what we do at Temple Shalom, when in the High Holy Days, we remind people we're fasting by choice on this day. There are many who are not. And so we bring food, we bring money to donate to Harry Chapin on Yom Kippur to help those who are needing. It's part of that call of Isaiah. Yes, it's good for you to fast, but don't just do it as a symbolic act. Be mindful that there are others who are in need in the community around you, and that has merit. And so we continue on with Rabbi Jacobs on our next screen, where she says, other texts specifically define housing as one of the obligatory types of tzedakah. The Bible commands that a poor person be granted sufficient for what lacks, according to what is lacking him. Now, if you've ever studied the rabbis, you know, the next thing you're doing is say, well, wait, what does that mean? What is sufficient for what lacks, and what does it mean according to what is lacking him? So this text explains it. One Talmudic text explains each phrase in that command as referring to a specific type of assistance that one might grant someone who is in need. Sufficient for what he lacks, that is a house. What is lacking, that is the bed and table. Significantly, this text imagines the primary needs of a poor person as being related to housing. Any reactions to that idea? When you think of someone who's in need, is housing the first thing that comes to your mind?
No.
Food and water.
Food and water. Basic necessity. When we think of food and water, we think of sustenance to get through. But what they're saying here from the rabbis is those are important, but also remember, you need shelter.
Well, that's number 3.
Well, is it number 3, or do you need shelter and you need things around you? And interestingly, it's not just shelter. It's not enough that they just have a roof over their heads. They should have what makes it a home, a bed and a table. They should have something. So it's not enough to just say, great, here's a tent. You're now protected from the elements. You need to make sure that they're being provided for in some way, that you're treating them with kavod, with respect. And if we look into our text, we go to our next one, it explains kind of what makes something a home. What's interesting, there's a Mishnah Torah, which is a Jewish legal book, has a section on the laws of the mezuzah. And it's not just where should you buy your mezuzah and how should you hang it with tape, glue, or nails. It goes into what is it that you should have in a home that's worthy of having a mezuzah hung on it, which is an interesting question for us. And so we see here there are 10 conditions that a house must meet in order for the resident to be obligated to put up a mezuzah. It must be at least 4 amot, and 1 amah is roughly 18 inches. Stuart, I'm sure you're doing the math in your head right now for how big of a home they need. By 4 amot, it must have 2 doorposts. It must have a lintel, which is a horizontal structure spanning the opening, so something between the opening. It must have a roof. It must have doors. The gate must be 10 tefachim, which is a tefach is apparently 3 inches, not our typical standard measurement, or higher. It must be for ordinary purposes. It must be made as a place for people to live. It must be made as an honorable place. It must be made as a permanent place. What stands out to you about the guidelines, what you need to have a home, a place where you can hang a mezuzah?
It needs to be permanent.
A place of stability, it has to be permanent. It can't just be a temporary dwelling. When we think of using temporary dwellings, what do we think of? Tents, we also think sukkot. We think of the sukkah. We think of something where you have, it's open on the sides, you can kind of see the stars, but it covers you some, but it's not great. No, to put up a mezuzah, it must have a permanence to it. It must have a structure to it. And so one of the pieces here is when you're thinking about what does it mean to have housing for people, it needs to be of a permanent enough nature that it's stable, that it's not going to be knocked over lightly. Now, listen, we live in Southwest Florida where there's a lot of wind, even stable things get knocked over. That's okay. But at least it should be under normal conditions, something that can survive the weather, that they're going to be protected in. And that this is an important value for us. We see our next text, this will be our last one for now, that when we talk about not only building homes, but access to homes, there's an interesting teaching in Bava Metzia that talks about how you treat people who you're renting space to. Because there's a question of home ownership versus rental. And it says here, one who rents out a house to another during the rainy season cannot evict the renter from the Sukkot until Passover, which means if you're not familiar with Israeli seasons, that's the rainy season. So if you've rented to someone during this time when the weather is at its worst, you cannot evict them during that time. You cannot leave them homeless during a time when they're going to be facing the dangers of the weather around them. If the rental was in the summer, the owner must give 30 days notice. And for a house located in the cities, both in the summer and in the rainy season, the owner must give 12 months notice. And for shops, both in towns and in cities, 12 months notice. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says for a baker shop or a dyer shop, one must give 3 years notice. Listen, the Bakers Guild, the Dyers Guild, they were really, Shimon ben Gamliel was on their side. Could have been his side. Listen, and for a lot of these rabbis, they had professions. So for all we know, he was a baker or he was working with dyes. But in all seriousness, why those, let's work backwards. Why did those get 3 years? What do those businesses require? That's different than other businesses, perhaps.
Someone to learn how to do it.
Well, it's not, but it's not about the people that do it. It's utilities, facilities, right? If you're a baker, you need ovens, which means at that time, it wasn't like they could just call up their local Best Buy or their local hardware or local appliance store and get new ovens. They probably had to build them, and they were probably built into the structure. So it was not an easy thing to accomplish. So you needed a build for that, you need a building. For a dye person, you needed a space where you could dye things for long periods of time. You probably needed large vats and things that you couldn't just easily transport from one to another. So there was a need there. Why in the cities do you get 12 months?
There's more availability for other housing.
Well, there's less availability. So in the city,
I'm sorry,
right? No, I understood where you're going there.
Yeah.
For. So it's the idea that you have in the cities where there's a lack of additional housing. A city means that there's probably some kind of barrier or something that demarks it as a city. There's only so many houses available. There's not a lot of options. So if someone's living in the city, you have to give them sufficient time to find another place to go. You can't leave them homeless. And now, if you're outside of the city, you have to give them at least a month, unless it's the rainy season. So there's very much an obligation here to be mindful of not just helping people who don't have homes receive homes and making sure that they have a roof over their head, but also being mindful of how our actions impact others in our community. Particularly if you're talking about in the city, probably the workforce. That you couldn't just create a situation where those who were the lowest income, those who probably were struggling the most to find a place to stay, couldn't go.
Shouldn't the reverse be true also? The tenant have those obligations to give
That's a
the
question.
notices
So they don't,
to the landlord?
interestingly, it doesn't have that in the text. The owners are less protected than the tenants. You can take
Well,
that
there's
for what you
nothing
will.
that protects the owners here. It's only protects the tenants.
And look at tenants, but keep in mind, I would say, Stuart, that in society at that time, if you had wealth, you had a lot more power than the people who didn't. And so the owners were in a position where they probably had other avenues for dealing with things than the tenants did.
Okay.
So it's not the kind of society we live in today, not a Western society. So they're also taking that into mind. But it's a valid point that they're very focused here on the tenants and on how you treat them. But I think it's a reminder also that they're writing some of these things at times when there weren't as many protections out there. There wasn't a government protecting people in the same
Well,
way.
there's something going on now in Collier County about notice by landlords to the tenant. But the reverse should be true. The tenant needs to give the landlord notice that they're leaving
It
within
would
a certain
seem-
amount of time.
Right,
I think 30 or 60 days, I'm not sure what it is.
Okay.
Depends
It's
on
a-
the terms of a lease. And I think for some reason, I know in Ohio, it was a mutual 30 days, if it was month to month.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I think it's worth also exploring, but I wanted us to start here as seeing from our text an understanding of the importance we have in thinking about housing and thinking not just about those who are currently without and how do we provide, but also how do we make sure that others don't become homeless, don't lose their homes. Quick, BB, and then we're gonna transition.
I hope this is related. I'm thinking about it in the modern context before land equated wealth. In the modern context, there's a lot of people who have wealth that isn't derived from owning property and renting it. How would they figure into this equation? Because
Tzedakah.
tzedakah, so maybe people who don't own property and don't lease it should be giving money to people who can't afford the rent. Would that be an appropriate interpretation?
Well, I might not say appropriate interpretation because it's not explicitly stated here to do that.
It
but
seems
it's
like we're
certainly-
missing out a whole, I mean, like, many of us are not landlords.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering how we can fit into the,
Sure. So if you go back to what Rabbi Jacobs was talking about, her texts are about all of us in general. The one we're just looking at is more specific to those who have control, who are owners and those who are renting.
right,
But Rabbi Jacobs' text, when she's talking about the thing from Isaiah, for example, that's not about landowners, that's about everyone.
right,
Has an obligation to be mindful of those who are in need around them, and you do so by acts of tzedakah. So yes, it would be through that. Keep in mind that at that time, you were expected to give significantly as a community, to the community general pot, so they could be given to those who were in need.
so that's where most of us would fit in, because we're not landlords.
Well, but at that time, yes and no, because at that time, most people were landlords. Most
No,
people
but I'm
owned
talking about
property.
now.
Right, today it would probably, it fits us, it feels a little more appropriate to be thinking about that today, yes. Yeah, and so this is where we're starting our forum conversation about affordable housing in our own community, mindful that we have an obligation to remember those who are in need of housing, to be thinking about those who are in housing but who might be struggling, and thinking about how is it we keep people with a roof over their head and in a home, a place where they can hang a mezuzah, so to speak. And so with that in mind, we welcome our two guests today, and we're gonna be doing this in a format so that each are gonna present for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're going to do some Q&A interactive pieces with them. And if you've been anywhere in Collier County in the last year and gone to any program about housing, you have probably met our two guests or heard them speak or are aware of the work that they are doing in our community. I'd like to first introduce Joe Trachtenberg. Joe is the chairman of Collier County's Affordable Housing Advisory Committee. He's been around our community for a number of years. He's been a leader at St. Matthew's House, which many don't know was actually co-founded by one of our rabbis, Rabbi Schusterman, as well as other faith leaders here in our community, as a place to provide a temporary shelter for those who are struggling and in need in our community. And he's also an alumnus of Greater Naples Leadership, is formerly a CEO, and has been involved in many other projects both here and in New York City area. Joining him today is Elizabeth Ratty, who is a longtime resident. She's the head of the Collier County Tenants Union, and she's the co-administrator for the Rise Up Against the Collier County Housing Crisis Facebook page. They're each going to have a chance today to speak to us about their perspectives about what's going on regarding housing in our community. And then we'll do our Q&A. And for the Q&A, for those who are watching us, we'll be watching the Q&A part of the webinar. So if you have questions you'd like to pose to our speakers, please put those in the Q&A, and either Dustin or I will notice those and filter them and get them to our guests today. But thank you both very much for joining us today. We are delighted. And this is, interestingly, we're talking about housing, and this is our first time in what is part of our new home, this new building for the Jewish Federation of Greater Naples here in our Temple Shalom room. So we are delighted to be in our new house of sorts, meeting with the two of you, talking about housing. So I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you. Which one do you want to go
Who
first?
wants to go? Joe, why don't you start us off?
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Phil. I'm delighted to share the stage with, or the table with Elizabeth. I'm proud of what she's doing and how hard she's working for the folks in Collier County that don't have the mouthpiece, that don't have the ability to stand up and fight for themselves. If I could just begin very, very briefly by making two comments, going to the Judeo-Christian comments that the rabbi made. First, Rabbi mentioned I spent 11 years at St. Matthew's House. 6 of them were as board chairman. It's exciting when you consider a Christian faith-based organization that has a Jewish board chairman for so many years. And I think it speaks well of them. In the course of this, I've gotten to know an awful lot of people that we feed, and St. Matt's has an incredible feeding ministry. And I think it's important for us to be mindful of the fact that when you see these people lining up at the 20 or 25 different sites every week collecting food, that virtually all of them are employed. These are not people that aren't working. These are people that are spending so much of their money on rent and spending so much of their money on gasoline that they don't have money left to buy food. And these are teachers, and they're healthcare workers, and they're people that for the most part are embarrassed to be on these food lines. So I think it's important that Phil and the rabbi make reference to this. This is an evidence of the problem that we've got. The HUD agency says that people should be spending 30% of their wages on housing. And we see people in Collier County spending 70% of their wages on housing. So I've got some prepared remarks, which I'm going to make, and then we'll listen to Elizabeth. And I do hope you'll ask a lot of questions, some of which we won't know the answer to, but we'll certainly try our best to answer them. So again, thank you for asking me to speak to you today. My platform is really a simple one. For some time, Collier County has been experiencing an affordable housing crisis. There are several reasons for this, but at the top of my list is the limited response by our elected officials, primarily at the county level, and others who could make a difference. And sadly, over the years, the situation has gotten progressively worse. Last year, City of Naples hired a consultant. They estimated that the shortage in Collier County is 10,000 units of affordable housing. That was a fixed number about a year and a half ago. It's going up 500 to 1,000 units a year. So to think of the hole that we've dug ourselves in, when we see our commissioners approving projects that are adding 200 or 300 affordable housing units, apartment units each year, let's keep in mind how tiny a dent this is making in the problem. Now, there are currently 48,000 men and women who work in Collier County and can't afford to live here. The places they used to be able to live in Bonita and Estero, Fort Myers Beach, they're either gone or they're equally unaffordable. So, so these folks spend 2 to 3 hours a day in their cars. And if you're on Interstate 75, between 6 and 9 in the morning or 3 and 6 in the afternoon, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This isn't a good thing, and I'll tell you more about it in a bit. Now, most of the folks in this room own their own home. They're celebrating their good fortune of having selected Naples as a terrific place to live. Your house is probably worth more today than you ever thought it would be. Mine is. And unfortunately, the reality is most of the folks that are our friends, the hardest decisions that we make each day are our tea time reservations and our dinner reservations. We no longer have a newspaper that covers our local news. Our elections of government and board members are mostly left to other people who care more about it than the vast majority of people that we know. So why should we care about affordable housing? Aren't rising rents and record home sale prices indications that we live in a great area? Shouldn't we just celebrate it and go to dinner? And I'm here to tell you that we have a problem and that you're not going to like what's coming. Now, recently, Greater Naples Leadership organized a forum attended by over 400 of our friends and neighbors. I know some of you were there. We heard presentations from our region's largest employers explaining the challenges of hiring and retaining people. We heard heartbreaking video commentary from nurses, from teachers. We heard one outrageous report, and I just spoke to her the other day at Wynn's, from a 75-year-old cashier in the hardware store whose rent got increased by $850 a month. Yeah, I'm worried about landlords, but not too much. I'm mostly worried about the tenants and this 75-year-old store clerk that basically was told you have until April. So she got good notice, but no place to go. You know, I walked away from listening to the representative from the sheriff's office and Paul Helch from the hospital talk about their employees who commute 2 hours at each end of a 12-hour work shift. Can you imagine working a 12-hour shift, spending 2 hours before? Now, my age, there's not even time for a nap in between. And if I don't have my afternoon nap, then that's a problem. But I was in a meeting this morning. The city of Naples today has 17 openings in their police force. That's 25%. That's 25% of their police force. And last week, 2 more gave their notice. So that adds to the 25%. Situation in the county is worse. Our schools continue to operate, of course, but how is learning impact when reduced teacher count means increasing class sizes? And do we really want to keep eliminating elective programs and focus on, well, certainly some in our government want to eliminate a lot of elective programs, but that's what happens when you don't have enough teachers. I still remember the first time I met Val Wendrick, the deputy superintendent of schools, and it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and she apologized. I was in her conference room, and she scratched her head and brushed food out of her hair and explained to me that she had spent the morning teaching a special ed class. Here's the deputy superintendent of schools that spent the morning substitute teaching a special ed class. This is crazy. And what is our largest employer? Leaders at Naples Community Hospital and Collier County Public School describe how excited they are and how excited their prospective employees are when they pick them up at the airport and tour them around, and how despondent they are when they take them back to the airport after they've met with a realtor or two and would love to take a job in Collier County, but realize there's no place to live. And that is exactly the situation that we've got today. Last year, the city of Naples voters passed a referendum to allow the city manager to live outside the city. Even the city manager can't afford to live. What kind of message does that send? And our last speaker at the forum, Tony Ridgway, restaurant owner, said it best when he said, I'm in business to provide this service to my customers. I watch as my employees work 2 jobs a day and are exhausted. He said, it's so depressing seeing this happen. So the challenge the employees and employers have has the ability and will change our lives as we know it. And I'm sitting here before you and saying that the quality of life that we have come to expect will not prevail. As it becomes more difficult for our essential workers to find places to live. Fewer will seek employment in our community. We're already seeing reduced hours in our clubs, some of our restaurants. We're seeing gas stations that aren't open 7 days a week. How long can our hospitals rely on traveling nurses? Emergency service workers who put in 20 hours a week of overtime on top of their 12-hour-a-day shifts. So it's ironic that our biggest problem results from living in such a popular place. And COVID taught nationwide, taught people who could live anywhere in the country that they wanted to, how great a place Naples is. We have the highest number of people who work remotely in the country. And that's a remarkable statistic. The price of land has gone ballistic. Developers have seen what so far seems to be an unlimited ability to raise rents. With land being purchased by market rate builders and interest in building costs rising, workforce housing builders hardly have a chance to compete in this market. And I have to say, I remember growing up in Brooklyn when whether you lived in a house you owned, which was very few of my friends, or whether you lived in a house you rented, there was stability. There was a presumption that when your lease expired, you'd stay where you lived and there would be a reasonable increase. Forget about that. As Elizabeth will talk far more than me, there is no more stability. And I feel sorry for anybody, whether they're a senior or whether they're a worker who is a renter. Now, building affordable housing is being done elsewhere in Florida, where local governments are helping developers make a reasonable return. We have no right to expect that people are going to come in here and build affordable housing developments and lose money on it. That's idiotic. There's no expectation that should happen. If we're going to attract developers to build, we have to expect they're going to make a reasonable profit, and that can't happen in Collier County today. We need to pass ordinances increasing density per acre. We need to donate excess land to our land trust. We need to ease zoning restrictions. We need to rethink how we defer impact fees, which are among the highest in the state of Florida. Our leaders have the ability to do all of these things if we impress upon them the importance of supporting and building housing for our workers. And now I'll first tell you that serving as a county commissioner is a hard, often thankless job. Pressure coming from all different directions. Currently, the loudest voices they're hearing are the NIMBY voices. They're not hearing voices from the folks sitting in this room that are interested in hearing Elizabeth and me speak. And the message that's being delivered to our commissioners is we don't want this development here. There's also a lot of confusion about what constitutes workforce housing. And the people that say that building workforce housing will bring crime and filth and all the other things they're saying are lying. Nothing could be further from the truth. We're talking about housing for our nurses, we're talking about housing for our doctors, we're talking about housing for our teachers. We're talking about housing for the folks that take care of our pools and our lawns and bag the groceries, and these are our essential workers. They're gonna live every bit as nicely as anybody else sitting in this room or sitting in this community. And it's offensive to hear these groups talk about crime-ridden affordable housing. This isn't a new problem. Like most cancers, left untreated, it gets worse. 6 years ago this month, the highly respected ULI, Urban Land Institute, gave recommendations to our county commissioners. I'll read the paragraph of the recommendations. It said, not what their opening remarks. They say, not all of our recommendations, this is 6 years ago, not all of our recommendations will be popular with the community at large, which will need to prepare and adapt to the growth that is certain to occur in this county. But this panel believes they are essential to the long-term viability and sustainability of Collier County. Most of ULI's recommendations were rejected, and the crisis that they predicted is evident in place today. Now, government isn't the only place, the only responsible party. Minimum wage 2 years ago was $8.50 an hour. I remember businesses saying if it went to $10 an hour, it wasn't survivable. Well, today, the de facto minimum wage is $17 to $18 an hour, and it's growing. It's hard to find people willing to work at that wage even. Unfortunately, the $35,000 that generates won't get you a place to live any place in Collier County. So what used to be a decent wage, $35,000 a year, is now not a wage, a livable wage at all. Not in Collier County, and it's approaching the point where it doesn't exist in Lee County anymore either. So while we may not like government programs to help generate, support essential workers one way or another, we're going to pay these costs. We're going to pay them to our government agencies. We're going to pay them in wages. Now, I'll finish with one last thought, and I think it's a reasonable one, and it goes to Tzedakah. There is another complementary way to get this done. Naples and Collier County have beautiful parks. We have outstanding arts and entertainment venues. We have highly respected healthcare facilities, and we can largely thank the generosity of our foundations and our wealthy friends and neighbors for making this community the exceptional place it is. I believe it's now time for some of this generosity to be dedicated to affordable housing, to build housing for our doctors, our nurses, our emergency service workers. We have a land trust. It's a non-for-profit organization. I think they should be the recipient of donations, who should then buy land. And building affordable housing should be every bit as important as building an opera house, building a hospital, building an Artist Naples, or building a Baker Park. I mentioned earlier, 48,000 workers commute to their jobs from other counties. Be assured they can and will leave and find jobs closer to home, and they are. And that's why the number of jobs in Collier County and the city of Naples are as low as they've ever been, and why they continue to decline, why the school board or the school district can't hire the teachers that they need. Because if you can get a job and work in Sanibel, for example, where most of the people that work in the Sanibel building department came from the city of Naples, then why commute the distance that you're commuting? So I'm gonna stop here and let Elizabeth speak. I think all of us have to recognize responsibility is ours. We don't open our mouths. If we don't demand changes, if we don't tell our elected representative we're not happy with the way you're governing, then nothing's going to change. And it won't be me in a couple of years. Maybe there'll be somebody else invited to speak to this group who will be saying it's worse today than it was in 2023. You all should have done something about it. You had the opportunity, you didn't. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. So hold on to your questions. We'll come back and we'll have a Q&A. And as you're thinking about questions, please keep in mind that today we will be very carefully expecting questions. 1 sentence, 2 sentence questions, so we can really learn from our speakers today and not have long statements being made. So just keep that in mind as you're formulating in your head what you want to ask them. Elizabeth, we're delighted to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate you allowing me to come and speak and tell you the tenants side of what's going on in Collier County through this housing crisis. As previously stated, I am the head of the Collier County Tenant Union and an advocate for affordable housing. I'm just going to read this because it's much easier to read it. I talk fast, so it's just much easier to do it this way. So I'm first going to dive into a little bit on how this first came about. I, like many, had no idea the cost of rentals had increased and in some cases tripled within such a short period. My daughter sent me the list of my community and what the going rate was for my apartment as advertised on rentals.com. At the time, it was going for $4,700 for my 3-bedroom. And I thought that $1,682 was a lot. Just a year before, 2 bedrooms were going for $900 a month and 3 bedrooms between $1,500 and $1,800 in most complexes in the area of Collier County. excluding your high-end rental markets. To see an increase like that was terrifying. She then sent me a Facebook page created by Vicki Rodriguez, a Collier County public school teacher. It was called the Rise Up Against the Housing Crisis in Collier County. She created this group because she was, like many, receiving that terrifying lease renewal notice. Vicki was a single mom and working 3 jobs, literally to pay rent already. She couldn't afford any more than what she was doing. Of course, I reached out to her and we began, along with others, to partner together to not only try and help those in the community impacted by the rental crisis, but partner with community leaders to bring change along with both short-term and long-term solutions to our workforce housing crisis, thus creating the Collier County Tenant Union. Since then, I've learned so much and encountered so many families affected and displaced by this crisis. The stories and the cries for help began pouring into the Facebook page and my DMs. These families were and are in real crisis. At any given time, many will receive very little notice on their rents that they are going to increase by 500 to sometimes 3,000, and their leases might not even be renewed. Whether it's from a landlord selling their rental or just wanting to charge a much higher rent or turn it over into an Airbnb. This has sent people scrambling around trying to figure out what to do. With little to no rental inventory and prices that have doubled or tripled, many of these families ended up either leaving Collier County homeless or in communal living situations. I want to explain to you the experience most are dealing with while looking to find a rental unit here. So here's a little math. A 2-bedroom, 2-bath at $2,500 equals $30,000 annually in rent, just in rent. To qualify, your monthly income must be 3,000 or 3 times that monthly rent, which is $7,500. If you're going for a $4,000 apartment, that's that's basically, well, let me go back. That's $90,000 annually to qualify, just for that $2,500. A 3-bedroom at $3,500 to $4,000 equals $42,000 to $48,000 in rent annually. A base amount of $3,500 at 3 times your rent to qualify is $10,500 a month in income. Or $126,000 annually. In most cases, you have to pay first, last, and security. So if you're trying to rent a 3-bedroom, that's $10,000 you have to come up with. How many people can actually do that? So depending on where you're renting, you know, that's basically the bottom line, between 75 to 10,500, and with very little notice. So the competition is also, excuse me, I get dry very quick. The competition is also extremely heavy. You have multiple people competing for the same apartments. And you have people coming from all over the country that are willing to pay a whole year worth of rent to secure an apartment. The people in Collier County cannot compete with that. Most of them can't. So the average application for a family is about $500, between each person having to pay an application fee, administrative fees, and that's without a guarantee that you're even going to get an apartment. A lot of people don't meet these qualifying needs based on their figures and their income levels. Now, according to HUD standard, like Joe said, you're basically supposed to pay 30% of your income. Most of us are paying 75% of our income here in Collier County that are renting. The math makes no logical sense, and neither does the qualifying. 90% of single parents can't afford to live in Collier County any longer, and 33% of Collier County's residents are single parents. That should be extremely alarming. Many found that they can't qualify for these rentals based on the requirements, like I said. So they have been forced to leave their jobs and pull their children out of schools, neighborhoods, away from friends and other family members. And if you're a single parent with a custody agreement, forget it. I've seen some parents end up homeless and losing their children to the other parent due to an unstable living environment. And let's not forget about the high schoolers who have scholarships or have special programs to go to college and are being forced to leave their schools and their accomplishments. You can't pick up in a new school where you left off. A lot of those programs are already filled by other children. A lot of those teams are already filled by other children. You're pulling children out of schools and they're losing so much of their life. The mental health of these children is gravely being affected. A few of these families have been able to relocate outside surrounding areas of Collier County, but due to supply and demand, like Joe said, it's very difficult, especially after the hurricane, to get anything in Collier County. I'd like to share with you a story from a woman who allowed me to share her story at the Board of County Commissioners meeting. She said, I've been a good tenant and I've paid rent each month, even right after the hurricane when we had no electricity. I paid rent on time. They are jacking up the price here and they already know I can't afford it based on the income that I've already given them. So they aren't going to give me the option to renew. So my daughter and I are on the streets as of January 31st. Honestly, I don't know what I would have done if I had gotten a notice January 1st for January 31st. I am completely overwhelmed as it is, and this is the second Christmas in a row that I'll have to move. Last year, the owner that I was renting from suddenly decided to sell, and I had to move December 20th. We were homeless for about 2 months until I found this tiny 400 square foot, 1-bedroom for both my daughter and I. Now I have to pack up and move again, and I still haven't fully recovered from the last time. So now we have no choice but to officially leave Collier County, and I am an educator with 30 years of experience working with kids with autism and other special needs. In fact, the programs for the kids with autism in Collier County Public Schools, I started in 1995. Prior to me moving here, there were no special autism services in Collier County Public Schools at all. Currently, I am working privately with several families in Collier County with severe ADHD, autism, and behavioral issues. But now I have to tell these families that as of January 31st, they will no longer get the help they need because I can't find an affordable place to live in Southwest Florida. And not for nothing, but I don't really feel like commuting to Naples to help families that have nice houses to live in when I can't afford a crappy apartment. So I'll just have to help families in places where I can't afford to live. So now my daughter is going to have to stay with my brother in Utah, so she has some level of stability until I get settled somewhere else. So yeah, that's my story. And as of January 31st, I'm officially out. Oh, and not for nothing, but good luck taking care of all the adults with special needs in Naples when no specialist can afford to live here and provide lifespan services. This is one of hundreds of examples that I've encountered. The new faces of homelessness, as I call it. Some also with disabilities or sick loved ones or elderly who can't afford the rent increase, or like I said before, given next to no notice that they have to be out of the place they've called home for years. Sadly, these individuals are ending up on the street, homeless and sleeping on someone's couch because they are in impossible situations. A woman by the name of Brandy spoke at the Board of County Commissioners meeting in reference to the 60-day ordinance that I petitioned for and signed into state law. Back in October, that was just recently repealed by our county commissioners in December. She spoke about what currently is happening and her relationship to the rental crisis as a foster parent. She's also a realtor and a landlord and has housed over 15 children. And the last 5 children have been due to housing instability in Collier County. She stated that parents were sent into desperate situations because many of them were not given enough notice that their leases were going to double or not be renewed. These children weren't placed into foster care out of abuse by their parents, but because out of desperation, these children were put in communal living environments, which ended up being predatory doorways. She stated that landlords have the right to charge what they want, but as human beings, we have the responsibility to govern housing issues and what we do in a way that doesn't cost families their stability and these children their innocence. With a lump in my throat and tears streaming down my face, the burden of our community's actions or lack thereof got very real to me. I want to close with telling you this story. It's a story about a gentleman who was about the age to retire. And this will tie into what you were talking about. He was about the age to retire and worked his whole life in building homes for a contractor. The gentleman was good at what he does, meticulous, and he pays great attention to detail and used the highest of quality materials. But now he's at the age where he's ready to retire, wants to spend the remaining days with his family. So he goes to his employer and he says, hey, listen, it's time. I'm ready to retire and enjoy the rest of my life. So obviously his employer was upset. But he says to him, what can you do? Can you just build one more house for me? Can you just do one more project for me? So he agreed. Along the lines of the project, you can see that his heart was just not in it anymore. He was cutting corners, using cheaper materials, and not enough of the most important structured materials. He was just trying to drift through it. And if you ask me, that's kind of a sad way to end your career and your legacy. So the employer comes and they do all the inspections. And as they walk out, the employer turns around and takes the keys out of his pocket and hands the man the keys and says, here, this is my gift to you for your retirement. What a different feeling this man had now, realizing that this house that he was building for himself, realizing that he had built what was possibly going to be the inheritance of his future generations. And also what he would have done differently had he only known better. I told you this story because it profoundly spoke to me. Our city is much like this house, and we are the builders. We can either choose to build a house that we can be proud of, being mindful to consider how important every detail is to creating a legacy that we can pass on to our generations to come, or we can ignore the essential materials and overlook the importance of their role in sustaining the structures and watch it collapse. We have a choice. Do we walk out of these doors and leave behind what we've heard today? Or will we begin to ask the hard questions? Do we open our eyes to the lack of sustainability and start to see just how valuable each of us is to the viability of this community? Do we cultivate conversations to help change the mindset of NIMBYism, which means not in my backyard, and create honest dialogue as to what this city will look like or function like without its workforce? We need to have those not so comfortable conversations with friends and family members and community leaders that might be part of the problem instead of the solution. Our community cannot sustain much longer with the mindset that my neighbor's doing it, so I should too. It's the mindset we're making the highest revenue I can possibly get out of my rentals outweighs the humanity. It's a choice to displace and possibly ruin the lives of others to gain a higher revenue. And it's not just business to those lives that are being destroyed in the process. And finally, we need to recognize how important our workforce is, from the sales clerk to the home care nurse, giving our family members care, to retail workers, your teachers, your hospital personnel, your waiters, and your senior citizens, because they are all the new faces of homelessness. And you, like the builder, have the opportunity to do things right and to build a legacy that you can all be proud of. I implore that you truly have listened to what we're saying and are prepared to take action, because the future of this community depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe and Elizabeth, for starting this conversation for us about what's going on in our community. For some, I know this is information you might have heard in other places. For others, it might be the first time. But here's our chance now to have a little bit of interactive engagement with the two of you and to be able to learn more about these topics. We'll open in a moment to the floor to ask questions. I do implore you, please, when you're called on, ask a question and allow our presenters to be able to enlighten us. We would also ask that you ask questions that you don't know the answers to. So don't set them up for things, but present questions that can help all of us get a little bit deeper in this topic and learn a little bit more. So with that, the floor is open for those like start. Don.
And one, thank you both for your comments today and for your work. I have two quick questions with probably complicated answers. One is, I mean, realistically, I'm not sure everyone in Collier County will have a home. What does success look like? You know, you're both working so much of your lives to accomplish. What does success look like? How do you win? What's a win for you? And the other is, how does the agricultural industry, you know, Immokalee is part of Collier County, how do they contend with this? Their farm workers are not making, you know, high wages. How have they solved the problem? Is that a model that the rest of Collier County could use?
You want me to start?
Mhm.
So starting with the second question first, drive through Immokalee and look at the way people live. It's a disgrace if this county and this state had a legitimate board of health, most of those trailers would be gone. Unfortunately, there's no place to put those people because homeless shelters are already full. So so they allow the landlords to put 3, 4, 5 families in single trailers and let them survive. So Immokalee is hardly an example of how things should be done. What's a win to me? A win to me is getting 4 out of 5 commissioners agreeing to first even put on their agenda the zoning changes that have been proposed, that were proposed 6 years ago by ULI. Allow greater density, allow quick conversion from commercial to residential without having to hold public hearings. Do something that the state adopted a year ago, which allowed counties and city commissioners and councils to override everything if it comes to affordable housing. The state has given them remarkable tools to create more affordable housing. Only one county in the state of Florida has so far taken advantage of those special new rules. Not to say that a lot of counties aren't doing a whole lot more. So what's my vision? Where do I see success? I get a call at least every day from a developer, from a banker, from a consultant that's trying to put deals together. They want to know, what can I do? How can I help? What's it going to take? And my response is, people have to be able to make money building affordable housing in Collier County. If they can't, developers aren't going to build here. Collier County has to figure out how to move faster. In 2018, I'm sorry to give this long an answer, but in 2018, Collier County bought 70 odd acres, the Golden Gate Golf Course, to build 350 units of affordable housing and to provide the community with a golf course. Okay, it's now 2023. They just realized now that they have arsenic and other environmental problems there. So this is I bought a lot of property in my life. I've never bought commercial property and not done an environmental phase 1, phase 2 before I bought it. 4.5 years after they bought it, now they realize they have an environmental problem. They're talking about maybe breaking ground for this project in the summer. I mean, there's something that has to be done differently. It starts with adopting ordinances that will allow developers to make money building affordable housing in Collier County. That's what I'd like to see.
Thank you, Jeff. Elizabeth? You want to respond?
I just want to say that, that success to me would be, I think, long-term, and I know it's a long stretch, but, you know, landlords doing what I spoke about and being mindful, you know, I did put forth the 60-day notice. Of course, it got repealed. That was a win for me until it got repealed. But you know, you have to look at the collective gathering of people in this community. That's what success is going to be. It's going to be enough people coming together saying that we really want to do something and do it now. That we can't just keep sweeping things under the rug and pretending that it doesn't exist. And then another year goes by and another year goes by and another year goes by, because that's what our local leaders are hoping for. Because they haven't done anything to help try and change anything in Collier County concerning affordable housing or workforce housing. And the mindset of workforce housing needs to change. We need to really get out in our neighborhoods and let people know that this is not, you know, a low income project. This is not something that we're used to seeing in large inner cities. That's not what workforce housing is. And success to me would be changing the mind of people so that we don't have 900 to 1,000 people showing up against a project being done because it has the label affordable housing, and we have 10 or 15 people showing up to a meeting on affordable housing. Those numbers need to switch. And that's what success would be for me.
Thank you for those answers. Sandy?
I'm intrigued by the private sector possibility that you mentioned. I'm thinking about the Dursos, I'm thinking about the Lashides, and I'm thinking about Myra Daniels, who all had visions for big projects and somehow managed to get them done. Is there anybody, has that effort been made to try and find people who care about this issue? You know, wealthy people who have that kind of, I don't know how you get it going. We can all say we should, but.
I don't know how to get it going either. If I, honestly, if I did, other than to throw the idea out and hopefully it lights a fire. In the 2 weeks since the forum, I've received 2 emails from presumably wealthy people who asked me to whom should they donate money, that they were moved by what they heard. And I said, right now, the #1 builder of affordable housing, workforce housing in Collier County is Habitat Collier. It's the #1 habitat organization in the United States. They're a remarkable organization. They can no longer afford to build single-family homes in Collier County. They're now looking at building multi-unit homes. They can no longer afford to limit their homes to the 60% AMI, area median income, that they used to focus on. They're now building units for people at 100 and 120% AMI, simply to make the economics of what they're doing work. But they're a remarkable organization. St. Matthew's House is building affordable housing. There's an organization in Immokalee, the Alliance for Fair Housing, that's building 128 units to get people out of those trailers. That's an organization. You get past that, and there's not a lot going on. 3 small affordable housing projects by McDowell Builders. And then after that, it's the 20% in market rate housing that's being built, that's mostly going for people at 100 and 120% AMI, the people that are already making over $100,000 a year that Elizabeth talked about, so.
Do you want to add to that or you go to the next one? Okay, I'm gonna take Story over here next to 1 second. There's a connected question to what you're just asking. Online Susan poses, is there any option to create a pool of dollars to subsidize some of these issues of housing or rent, or to try to cap the rent issue? Are either of you aware of any efforts to try to create financial support for what's being?
So I'll give you two examples, and then I mentioned that golf course. $10 million of the money that went to that came from the Collier Foundation, the Schultz Foundation, and the Moorings Park Foundation. So those three foundations very much care about affordable housing. Unfortunately, they're a little sour about how those were handled. The second thing, which I think is the most exciting, 2 years ago, a group of very smart people created something called the Collier County Community Land Trust. And they are a not-for-profit, and they're available to take donations, buy land, and work deals with developers. And I would encourage you, learn more about the Collier County Land Trust. Michael Fahula and Steve Ruby are the executive director and the board president. Invite them to talk at a subsequent meeting. They'll tell you what they do, and there's an exciting opportunity for the future.
Stuart.
I presume that Florida has a housing finance agency that awards tax credits.
Yes.
That is how you get large companies to come in and build affordable housing, by awarding them tax credits for the equity that they need to get things started.
So there's no question that building affordable housing is complex. And the way it gets done is through a combination of tax credits, low interest loans, grants, and a number of other things. The path to doing that is clear. The problem is, if after you do all that, you can't build sufficient density in order to make money. Remember, interest rates have gone up, building materials have gone up, and purely doing what you're saying without having zoning regulations in place, and without having density rules in place, and without having impact fee rules in place that allow deferral, and the math still doesn't work. So what you just described is the way affordable housing is being built right now in Miami. It's being built now in West Palm Beach. It's being built in Orange County.
And it does in other states.
And it's being built all over the United States, and it's being built in Fort Myers, in Lee County. It's being built in other parts of Florida, but there needs to be a pathway. And our Collier County commissioners right now hold the key to that pathway. What you're saying is known to all the developers. It's not a magic wand, but it does need some basic rules in place in order to make it
It
work.
has to start with the ability to have density.
Exactly.
And I just wanted to mention one thing too, is that we also need to, hold our commissioners accountable for these, the tax credits or the deferments like you had mentioned. Because a lot of times what happens is by the end of the deal, these credits go from 30 years to 10 years. And then what happens is these companies are then responsible for paying after 10 years instead of 30 years or instead of 99 years. And so, like I said, by the time we get done to the end of the deal, the rug's been pulled out from under some of these developers because our commissioners are doing that. And so then it gives our developers less incentive to want to build here because they have to cut that check at the end of 10 years versus 30.
What Elizabeth is talking about is impact fees. Impact fees, $25,000 per unit. If you want to provide infrastructure, highest rate in the state exists in Collier County. There is a rule in place for deferring impact fees if you're building affordable housing. The problem is if your affordable housing is structured to allow for 30 years of affordability, but your impact fee deferral is only 10 years, not the 30 years, and you got to come up with the cash, it's useless. And basically the developers have said to our county, you haven't given us anything. We need some relief in terms of the way impact fees are developed. And if you're building 100 units and you're talking about $20,000 a unit, then the numbers grow very quickly as to how many millions of dollars we're talking about in impact fees.
Are the Immokalee developers subject to that impact?
So there are different rules for Immokalee. Immokalee is unique, but the answer is yes, they are subject to it, but
But
they're
not to 25.
not to the 25,000. They're the only place that has basically a carve out and some different protective devices.
Thank you. Phoebe.
These are land use questions related, if you're in the business. This is to both of you, where would you, in terms of locating this affordable housing, where would you put it? And what do you think about the 20% allocate rule if we're so short on land?
I put it anywhere. I mean,
Are there any limits to where you put it?
you know, it's interesting. I always.
It's a trick question. You know what I think.
I think the best place for affordable housing right now is in the East Naples area. The county commissioner that was responsible there for many, many years basically said that affordable housing would be built over her dead body. And so they stopped building in that area. They have a very powerful CRA that won't build affordable housing in that area. I think affordable housing, the closer you could get to the jobs, the better it should be. I don't come into this with any prejudice as to where it should be built. I think our commissioners have done a fairly good job in planning roads. They need to do a better job. I don't know if that answers your question.
No.
I'm sorry. Just
didn't
can I just
answer.
add another item?
But
please?
it didn't answer.
No, but have you thought about a Mount Laurel type decision? You know what that is?
Yes, and
Percentage of what's being built has to be built for affordability.
That's exactly what.
so that was the recommendation. ULI made a couple of recommendations that never got off the front page. And one of them was that the Board of County Commissioners add 2 at-large commissioners. That when you have 5 commissioners and they each have a zone, and you require 4 votes for a supermajority for most decisions, then you're not going to get much done. That's how Donna Fiala was able to block any building in East Naples, East Naples. So they said have seven commissioners. The second thing they recommended was to set up the kind of rules like you're talking about, where every community has to have a certain amount of affordable housing. That was eliminated from consideration the very first day. Other things that I had a meeting 2 weeks ago with Kathleen Pasadomo. I said, Kathleen, what's happening with rents is outrageous. It's just, I'm in a religious institution, so I'll say it. I don't know how people go to synagogue on Saturday, go to church on Sunday, and on Monday do what they do. I don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me. How do you spend that time praying in the hope that there's another life that you go to, and the next day you raise your rents by $2,000 and refuse to give notice to your tenant? Then I don't get it. I mean, it's kind of naive on my part, but
That's
I
a
don't.
question in New York City, LA, and everywhere else.
Yeah, I understand, but it's still my question, and I'm entitled to ask it. So yeah, the second thing I asked Kathleen, when are you going to give control from the state to? I want her answer to the first question. There will never be rent control rules in the state of Florida. Never. Forget about that. Second thing, when are you going to give local control to Airbnb and VRBO and let the local people decide what they want? They said, we're not going to do that. The local people made a mess out of it. We're going to keep it as a statewide regulation, basically, because that's what the realtors want. And this state is much more friendly to realtors than it is to renters. And that's a reality. So you don't like it? Move.
So one question that came in online, and then Burton, you've been waiting patiently, was wondering, in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, we saw significant price raising in the rents and other resources. Has that come down? And if not, how is that going to impact housing going forward as we move beyond this current season time and back into the regular year?
Well, I don't think it's going to change outside of season into the regular year, because there's such a supply and demand situation with housing. There are people that are on waiting lists to get apartments. Just simply because of the fact that, you know, FEMA has not acted on, you know, the trailers. They haven't acted on a lot of things that they needed to do, that people are in hotels, they're displaced, they're waiting. So wherever a rental market is now, it's gonna stay that way, unfortunately. Hurricane Ian exacerbated the whole situation. And where I saw a lot of what was happening, and where people contacted me literally every day, all day, was where their landlords were putting them out because the place was deemed inhabitable or uninhabitable, let me say. And then they would do a little bit of renovation and they would double the price of that apartment. Or they would offer a different apartment in a complex area. They would offer a different apartment that wasn't messed up, but you would go up under a new lease with a almost double rent price within 30 days. And you had no choice, so you're gonna be on the street. So the way that things are happening in Collier County, unfortunately, I don't see that changing, because the people that are doing it are being allowed to do it. The landlords, just from what I'm seeing, a lot of them are these large corporations. Some of them aren't even in the country. Some of them aren't even in the state. They're calling the shots. There's no humanity. And so a lot of times what has been happening is that they reset these market rates and they do it on purpose. So that's what has been happening throughout the last couple of years, is they keep resetting that market rate and keep resetting it and keep resetting it. And as long as supply and demand is there, they're gonna keep jacking it. And it's not gonna come down, because we are so upside down between here. Southwest Florida is completely upside down, that there's no way that that's gonna even come down.
Yeah, if the question is, after the pressure is relieved, from the hurricane, won't prices start dropping? And I can point to 2007, when our then sitting Board of County Commissioners said, wow, the Great Recession, affordable housing problem is solved. In fact, they went so far as to take something called the Housing Trust Fund, which had a decent amount of money in it, and they distributed all that money back to the developers. So we don't need a housing trust fund anymore. Affordable housing has solved. Southwest Florida is the most popular place to live in the United States. More people are coming here. Every survey shows, and it's no longer just Naples. It's Cape Coral. It's places that used to house our people in need of affordable housing, and now those places have become the most desirable place. So anybody that's putting their money on the fact that selling real estate short in Naples or in Collier County, I think you're making a bad economic decision.
Well, you just touched on something that I know if Susan Hager were here in person, she would have her hand up right now saying, so it's not just Collier County, it's Southwest Florida. What are we seeing between Lee and Collier, and what's the relationship there as far as affordable housing? Most of the information conversation has been about the Collier County Board of Commissioners, what's going on north of us and how do we see it, because the lines are all blurred. People live all over Southwest Florida, and while those lines are there on the map, it doesn't, our lives overlap.
So that's a great question, and it's not just Southwest Florida. To put it in perspective, I live I spend the summers and have an apartment in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I can tell you that Every week I get the local neighborhood news and affordable housing in the Upper West Side and in Manhattan and in New York City is big news. Certainly every ski resort, all over the United States, there's affordable housing crises. We're not unique, except that we live here. So this is our problem. And the fact that Wyoming may have an affordable housing crisis, or New York City might have an affordable housing crisis, well, that's not our problem. Our problem is what happens here in Collier County. That's the only reason I'm doing this. Now, I can look enviously at Fort Myers and at Lee County. They're putting money where their mouths are. They are increasing density. They're allowing zoning. They're actually funding purchase of land. They're doing all kinds of creative things. There are little mini houses being built. There are conversions of commercial units going to residential at a much greater pace. I've seen one of those happen here. It was a collaboration between Moorings Park and NCH. They bought a motel out on Collier Boulevard and are starting to move people into these 100 units, which has the county, by the way, up in arms because there are different fire zone rules in effect for a motel and a residence, and they're violating all those fire zone rules, moving people in. So that mess is gonna have to get cleaned up. I mean, there's employers actually doing something because they can't wait for us to do something for government. But my information is really more anecdotal. Like I said before, we don't have much in the way of a newspaper these days. So what I get to read is what you get to read. But when I was at St. Matthew's House, I had an opportunity to meet with Mayor Anderson on a number of occasions. They really care about their homeless problem in Fort Myers. Collier County just wants it to go away. They don't want to fund it. So Collier County works differently. Collier County is one of 67 counties. It is the only one that doesn't spend a penny for any social program. They'll do pass-through money in federal and state. They don't spend a penny. They expect donors to do that, contributions to private charities. Only one of 67 counties. So we got a tough road to hoe here. I mean, this is we're dealing with people that have a different philosophy.
Elizabeth, did you want to add to that?
As Joe said, Fort Myers is doing quite a bit to try and help. I had one of the city council members from Fort Myers actually came down and sat with me during one of the Board of County Commissioner meetings for the 60-day ordinance, because that was something that they were interested in passing. But when things exploded in the BCC meeting like it did, he was like, yeah, that's probably not gonna fly. So they're doing quite a bit. Like he said, they're Fort Myers is kind of different land-wise as well.
It's the city, isn't it? Not,
No.
it's not Lee County.
Lee
Well,
County is doing things also.
Lee County,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
our city of Cape Coral, which is the largest city in Lee County.
But I think
Hey,
they're.
Carl,
Let her finish. We have a couple of people with them.
Their land capability is a lot different than ours. When they did the study, what was it, the ULI, wasn't it? There were very few viable properties in Collier County that we could actually build on. That actually made any sense. There were plots of lands that weren't together. There were all these different things, and then they came down to what, like two or three?
That's not exactly right, Elizabeth. There's still an enormous amount of land in Collier County that can be built on. I mean, one of the challenges is that it keeps getting more expensive.
Mhm.
But
But the county already owned.
oh, you're talking about county-owned land? So there are land that both the county own, that the school district owns, that could have affordable housing built if they were willing to donate it. They're not ready to do that. No
Yeah, I
one-
think there were only two that they were viably looking, that they could viably look at. So that's a lot different than what Fort Myers.
Yeah, so it's a different situation, but we appreciate you providing that. Now, we only have about 2 minutes left, so Burton, you've been waiting
Sure, let me
patiently.
Finish my question.
What's it? Burton, ask your question, just say your question, BBC your question, we'll have 2 minutes just to do a quick lightning answer to that, and then we have a final one from online.
Mine is really.
What you're,
Where would you exclude buildings within the county?
I wouldn't exclude it anywhere.
Okay, that's fine. That's it.
Burton.
All right, there used to be federal subsidies, like for Section 8, unit-based and project-based. Those have all gone to the wayside? Or they're just?
No, there are tax credits, there are federal programs, there's all kinds, let me make clear, we are not here talking about Section 8 housing. We are not here talking
Right.
about government-owned and operated city housing. We're talking about privately owned workforce housing that makes economic sense, and that will be welcome, we believe, to our friends and neighbors.
So that would be what that motel is, that's the one I sent you the article, yeah, okay.
And our final question from online, I think, is a great way to end this. It comes from Liz, who asks, if we were to each take one action, what should it be out of this?
I'll tell you, I'll give you my very short answer. Do something. You each have a commissioner. Send them a note and tell them, why aren't you doing something about this? Even better, go to the next BCC meeting. They meet the second and fourth Tuesday of every month. Right at the beginning of the meetings, anybody from the public can stand up and talk for 3 minutes. Get up and, right now, all the people that you'd be astonished, people that get up and talk, they're opposed to COVID shots. They want more guns. They want, people that talk about things, it's astonishing what people talk about. Nobody stops them. It's their prerogative. I'm waiting for somebody to come and say, when are you going to do something other than Elizabeth, who speaks at almost every meeting? When are you going to do something to help renters? My mother just got evicted. She's 80 years old and she's got to pay $1,000 a month more in rent. Her Social Security went up $8. Where do you want her to go? In a homeless shelter? Will she climb up a bunk bed? It's within our means to let our elected officials know that we're not happy with what they're doing now. That's what I'd ask you to do.
I'd ask you to connect with your community. Have these conversations, like I said before, with people that you know, your friends, your family, those that are out in the community, those that you have dinner with, those that you're out and about. A lot of people stay in their own little bubbles and they aren't even aware sometimes at what people are going through. And some of those people that you're sitting at that table with, be that landlord that just evicted somebody. Hold people accountable. If they're doing things, if you know somebody has just jacked up somebody's rent just because they can, have that uncomfortable conversation. Go to those board meetings. There's many times where we've gone to these board meetings and it's just us. And we're fighting and we're fighting and we're fighting I can't even say the word, tirelessly.
Because you're tired.
But we can't do it by ourselves. So it does require action. It does require coming to meetings like this. It does require inviting your friends, your family members. Hey, I got a forum that I'm going to. Why don't you come with me? Because you never know what sparks in them by hearing what's been said. So, that one spark, that one seed grows beyond what we could have ever hoped. That forum the other day was 400 people. Usually in our Board of County Commissioners, there's 4 or 5 people.
So can we
I want-
send information to these 400 people, to us?
We did. If you go to gnlwebsite.org, there's gnlwebsite.org. Every one of the 400 people that attended got an email.
I didn't.
And did you fill out, did Did you fill out a clipboard, put your email
I
address?
was online.
Okay, anyway, I know what the plan was and I know who supposedly did it, so there may be exceptions, and if you give me your email address, or just
Okay,
go,
but
just
what
do
about
it.
here too?
Go to
So-
gnlwebsite.org, and it has the names of your commissioners, their addresses, their mailing, it has sample letters to write. It talks about the issues, it has a link to when I was interviewed by public radio last month, all kinds of good stuff on it.
Thank you, Joe and Elizabeth. We really are grateful for you taking the time today to meet with us. And this has been a great start for our education about what's going on in our community. We hope that, as I said, you'll not just take what you learned today for yourself, but that you will share it with others. You'll engage with others. And your one more thing can be coming to our next forum as we continue this conversation, learning about some of the solutions that are out there and also talking about what we want to do to make a difference in addressing the affordable housing crisis. Thank you both very much for your time and energy. Thank you to everyone who's here in person and to those who are online. Thank you to Phil and the planning committee for putting this together. We are grateful to all who are part of this conversation, and may we go from strength to strength and blessing to blessing by doing the good work of repairing the world around us. That's the good. That's the TOV. Thank you to our Takuna Lawn volunteers.
Amen.